with you a little bit. I have put together way more slides than we'll need to go through in a couple different sections, and I think hopefully this can be as much conversation and less of me sort of chatting. So feel free to chime in if you have questions as I go through things, or if there are things you want to talk about, or if some of the stuff is redundant. But I'll dive into sort of my overview, and like I said, our work is really divided between sort of political and policy communications, and we work sort of all around the country doing different policy issues. We do a lot of healthcare, environmental, a bunch of different things. So today, some of this is sort of overview, and some of it is sort of, we'll dive in a little bit of social media, and then a little bit about sort of the law, assuming most of you are sort of nonprofits, what's sort of allowable under the law generally, and I'm not a lawyer, so don't take my advice. I can tell you what I know. And then we'll talk a little bit about sort of communications planning, which I think we may be able to skip over because it sort of, I'll introduce you to a tool that I like to use with folks, and it's probably better used sort of if you want to go through it on your own. But let me dive in here. There we go. So, I'm not sure how old the rest of you are on this call, but I'm old enough that I remember, when media used to be simple. It was really, you had a couple networks, you had printed newspapers that came out once a day, and it was, communications were really very targeted and sort of clean. But today, things have obviously changed a lot. Instead of just having a couple different outlets, we have sort of paid, earned, owned, and social, or shared media. And what I mean by that is sort of, paid media is sort of clear that we've always had that. And we'll talk a little about how it's changed. Owned, or sort of, used to be your only owned media was like maybe a printed newsletter you sent out, but now it's sort of email, website, everything you own and circulate, including like e-newsletters and all that sort of thing. Earned media, used to have sort of one local paper, maybe 3, maybe 4 TV stations. With the advent of the internet, it's just ballooned like crazy. And then social platforms, sort of shareable, two-way conversation media is sort of really very new. And so, let's just go through sort of all the different, there's all the different types within this thing, what these all mean. So talk a little bit about our agenda for the day. These slides are probably in the wrong order, but we're going to go over sort of media landscape, and then jump into a little bit of social media, and then the law, and then communications planning. But let's start here with sort of us as sort of the white knight, the good guys who are trying to sort of get our message out there. And so the way I like to think about it is, it sort of used to be, we had to sort of come up with a strategy for how to do our paid media, and then we would reach our audience that way. And then we had to have another strategy for earned, and a final strategy for sort of our own, which was really, about communicating with our members and that kind of work. What started to happen first was that it's sort of, the world changed. Paid, everything sort of blew up. There became more and more. Sorry, my lights like to turn off when I don't move around enough. We started to see more and more outlets. So there was now digital advertising in addition to, just news, print, and television, and radio, and the same and earned. There are just more and more outlets, but we sort of always knew, there were a definable finite number, and we knew which media we picked, how to use them to reach our audience, and it was sort of pretty well defined, and the audience knew what they were. You could tell the difference between a paid advertisement, something you read in a newspaper, versus something you were seeing in somebody's newsletter or reading on their Facebook. But what's happened really in the last few years is it's all jumbled. It's it's now really impossible to know the difference, or almost impossible, between sponsored content on news sites, paid posts on Facebook or Twitter or any other social media, where you're actually getting an article published by a newspaper versus someone who's paying to promote that article to you. It's just harder and harder to figure out how to reach. It's harder and harder for the consumer to understand what they're consuming, and it's harder and harder as a communicator to figure out the path to, your message getting to the people you need to reach. So then we dived into sort of a little bit of how our life's changed. Social media is sort of the newest kill on the block. So I thought we'd just go through a little bit of my thoughts on how that works and some of the data behind what we need to consider. One, that the landscape is vast and ever changing. So, as soon as you get used to one thing, it's changing. But there are, we tend to think about Facebook and Twitter, but they're really, or any number of things out there. I have some clients who have been really effectively using Nextdoor lately for sort of community outreach, and in neighborhoods, and it sort of feels much more genuine, I think, to the consumer. So it's important that when we think about, we need to be conscious about which social media platforms you want to use. And I always say that, like, there's no reason that you don't have to be on all of them. Obviously, you can't be on all of them. But the important thing is that when you choose to be on one, that you do it well. And so better to be on fewer outlets that you can really manage. This data is a little bit old, but 7 in 10 Americans are on social media. These were 2017, but like 2 billion monthly users on Facebook, 1.5 billion on YouTube. These are just astronomical, the size and scope of these things. The percent of adults who are using social media has just been on the rise. This is really, think about a 10-year span here from 06 to 16. It's just insane. I mean, I've never seen it. I'm not sure the television spread quite this quickly, from initial to sort of 80% of the population using it. And it's just fundamentally changed everything we do. If you think about the how much people use it, Facebook is, 75% of users saying they follow it daily. It really is amazing how much people are consuming. And I'll just go through everyone. Facebook's the biggest, the 2 billion monthly users worldwide. It can be helpful for video, particularly. It's really, you need to keep posts short and specific, know your targets, post frequently, engage with your users. I think the key thing to remember with all these platforms is, sort of why they exist. And yeah, they're cool, and it's great that you can sort of use them for free, but they exist to make money, and they make money by selling advertising. So as much as you can do a lot of this for free, or a lot of nonprofits, it's important to really think about budgeting, even just to supplement and boost your posts, because the platforms themselves are going to be, are designed to maximize the posts that are paid, because that's what they need to keep in business. We could spend a lot of time talking about Twitter and Elon Musk. Who knows what it's going to be like in a couple months or a year, but it is, still sort of a really valuable tool, particularly for reaching reporters. Hopefully it will stabilize and continue in that role. LinkedIn, it's getting bigger. It is getting, I think, more and more users, and it is being used more and more by sort of folks who are pushing issues to reach really niche audiences. I think a lot of times it can be really effective if you're communicating in specific groups. They've created a lot of groups that people are in, and that's a great way to sort of get your message out there and sort of establish a brand. Instagram, I think, is harder and harder for a lot of small nonprofits. It's really very visual. Trying to squeeze a lot of text into, it just doesn't work on the platform. So I always tell people, if you really can't commit to doing it well, don't do it. And it's just, think about the importance of doing this to reach members. This is how they communicate with their members. And these numbers again are a couple of years old, but like members are on Facebook, they're on Twitter, whether it's members of Congress, state houses, city councils, whatever. They are communicating with their voters that way. And so it's important to know that if you want to reach those folks and influence them, that's where you have to be. So, these are just a couple, mistakes, common mistakes, things to avoid. Not linking to website from your social. I think, the importance is to sort of cross promote as much as possible. So always sort of lend people from your social back to your website, and vice versa. I think this happens a lot in nonprofits. They misunderstand sort of the sort of casual nature of social media. So talking points become very formal, and it just doesn't work. People want a conversational tone. They want to have, they want real authenticity for communication to work. We were talking about this a little bit, using too few or too many platforms. Like, either take on as much as you can, but don't take on more than you can do well. Treating social as an island, people sort of think, well, back in the, if you think back to the original documents, we can keep our social in our social lane, and then it doesn't really have to interfere with our other work. You just can't. It all blends together for users and for your audiences, so they see it all as one big thing. So you need to understand that, like, what you say on social may come up when you're giving a speech at the Rotary, and vice versa. You can't sort of have them totally separate and sort of ignore what you're have sort of a kid handling your social and ignore the rest of it. Another big problem is people don't maintain the platform. They sort of join LinkedIn and then they forget about it. The cartoon we had up there earlier about try to update every 5 years and keep it fresh. If you're going to do it, you got to do it well. And then quantity over quality. There are a lot of people who say there are rules about, it's important to have, X number of posts a day on Facebook and Y on Twitter. And there's some best practices and all that, but I think doing, like with all things, doing it well versus doing a lot of it is more important. And then there are always people make stupid mistakes. And I always say, you don't want to be, it's always important not to be stupid, and then also not to be too smart. I think that you try to outthink the platform, it's just not going to work. So, anybody have a question so far? Anything come up? Feel free to jump in. I'm going to go into a little bit of sort of, the law, borrowed heavily from the folks of the Alliance for Justice, who do this better than anybody I've seen in terms of communicating how what's possible. I assume most of you are affiliated with 501c3 nonprofits. What's sort of lobbying? I think this is the real easy definition is sort of the green light, yellow light, red light. Everything, most of the things we do, influencing corporations, regulatory efforts, going to conferences, educating legislators, research, training, litigation, public education, organizing are all just fine. Lobbying, there are a bunch of rules around, and partisan political is obviously not allowed by nonprofits. So with that, it's sort of like, all right, well, okay, it's allowed, but how? It's limited, but how and what is it? So there are basically two types of lobbying, direct and grassroots. Communications direct sort of is communications to a legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation. Grassroots communication to the general public that expresses a view about the legislation and has a call to action. So it has to meet all three of those or all four of those to be technically qualify as lobbying. So I'm going to go through a lot of this and sort of what the communication has to be. So that's a duplicate slide. With legislators, it's the same thing. You have to go through and communicate with the legislator, express a point of view. So then it's like, these are all, sorry. The question is like sort of, we'll go through a couple examples sort of social media posts, like, is this lobbying? And I think, you're saying, okay, is this communication? Yes. Is it with legislator? Yes. And are you expressing a view about specific legislation when you say you're meeting with Montana's representatives to advocate for more wild and scenic rivers? Probably. So that is direct lobbying because you've gone to there. It's important to remember who's sort of not legislators. School boards, zoning boards, a lot of executive authority stuff we'll get into a little bit. And what does that mean? That there are a lot of people who you just don't have to worry about. You can communicate with without worrying about running into your lobbying laws. And then what is specific legislation, right? You have to be able to say, a specific bill, a budget, something like that. It counts as specific legislation if it is a specific policy proposal. Is how the IRS defines it. It's not well defined, but identifying a problem solution that can only be accomplished with new legislation. It doesn't necessarily have to have been something that is written or introduced, but if it is kind of a gray area and you have to use your judgment or find a lawyer on your own. But like that example we had before where they were advocating for, cleaner rivers, that was specific enough that we think it's lobbying. So what is not specific legislation? We run into this a lot, is sort of regulations, state or federal regulations, because there's no vote on them, are not lobbying. You can't lobby on them. Even if you can advocate for them to legislators, but there is no legislation, so that you don't have to count that towards your lobbying limits. Executive action, urging action on executive orders or enforcement of existing laws or taking a position on a piece of litigation, all of those are sort of exempt from any lobbying restrictions. And I took some of this from I'm in Pennsylvania, so there's some Pennsylvania examples in here. So like you can advocate for regulations for state agencies, not lobbying. You can advocate for on behalf of executive order, not lobbying. You can work on how an existing law is enforced, and that's also not lobbying. And so the last definition of that we were talking about is the call to action for making something. To go back to this thing, for grassroots communication to be lobbying, it has to be communication that goes to the general public, expresses a view about legislation, and has a call to action. So what does that mean? Anything asking people to contact legislators, providing a way to do that, providing a mechanism like on an email, or click a link to contact your legislator, or a phone call where you're patching them through, and anything where you're identifying specific legislators. So what is not a call to action, and how do sort of folks define this? Sort of, I think you see this a lot in advertising around leading up to elections, groups that can, instead of saying contact your legislator, they just say learn more, support our efforts, get involved, join us, on those things. You can communicate to the general public and express a view about specific legislation, but if you don't have a call to action, then that is not lobbying. So here's a couple of good examples. Supporting the bipartisan infrastructure deal. This was a communication from Facebook or Instagram. It does talk about specific legislation. It does go to the general public, but there's no call to action. So this would not be lobbying. Um, this one, same thing. It is communication to the general public that expresses a view. But it says tell your legislators to support the brighter PA budget. So that is a lobbying communication. And so here, like, what if you took the same exact piece of legislation, but we took out the tell your legislators, and everything else remains the same? Then it's not, because we remove the link, remove the direct call to action. It's not legislation. It's not lobbying. And then, of course, there are a bunch of exceptions to the lobbying rule, which make it really into the weeds. You can communicate on nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. If you have a request for technical assistance from a committee chair or somebody else to testify, all these other things. There are a bunch of other ways you can get around. You can avoid having to report something as lobbying or use lobbying dollars to do it. This is an example of just nonpartisan analysis. They obviously, the Pittsburgh Budget and Policy Center here was advocating a policy because they believe that there are ways to avoid evictions, but they didn't. They did research and produced it broadly, and so it doesn't count as lobbying, and then it can contain indirect call to action. I'm gonna skip over this last stuff. So anything else? I'll stop here for a minute. Anybody have anything? Any questions?
Does the IRS produce any documents which try to define what's lobbying or not lobbying?
They do. The Alliance for Justice, where most of these slides came from, does a much better job than the IRS does of producing documents that sort of help explain it in real world terms. The IRS language leaves a lot of, there's a lot of ambiguity. And the Alliance for Justice sort of exists to help nonprofits, communicate within the law. It's one of their big, their sort of bolder advocacy program is really built to sort of help the nonprofit community at large communicate better and make sure they're doing it within the law. So I wouldn't, I would not recommend trying to dive in. If you're not a lawyer, I wouldn't recommend trying to dive into the IRS directly. I would go through the Alliance for Justice or your local lawyer. Anybody else? Sorry, I've been talking really fast, so we've gotten through a lot of this. The last thing, and I try to put together sort of a sense of sort of the things that I think a lot of local nonprofits usually run into, hurdles into. One of the things, this last piece on communications planning, there's a tool that I like to use called the Smart Chart. You'll see it. There's a link. I think it's smartchart.org. This is sort of adapted from that. It is a great tool for planning your communications. I think it's often nonprofits don't take the time to or think they need a real plan. But I think that it's the most important step, so that you can sort of make sure you're both sort of agreeing to a goal and figuring out how you can get there from the beginning without instead of sort of reacting. It helps you, I think, keep a big group on target, especially if you've got a lot of volunteers. It helps you sort of go through the steps to make sure that you're giving everybody what they need, to have clear messaging and clear direction, so that you don't have to worry about people going sort of off script and causing problems. So I'm going to walk through these very quickly. Again, like it's smartchart.org is a free resource. If you are working on communications, I highly recommend sort of going through a planning process. It always starts, any plan starts with sort of getting your goal, right? What is it you're trying to do? What's the piece of, piece of policy, what policy are you trying to change? What are you trying to change it to? And then, you need a broad goal, and then from within that, you need objectives about how to help you reach that goal. And it's, the smart chart is the goals need to be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound. So this is a little bit of the who, what, when, where, why, and how that we all grew up with, but I think they're a little more precise. And I think this is key. The um, you can have you can have more than one objective. You should have more than one objective, but if our goal is to change, use the Pittsburgh example, we want to change policy around eviction process. In the first 12 months, we're going to generate 12 news stories about evictions and the impact they have. Would be a goal, an objective. I'm sorry. The goal would be to change the policy. So then go through it. The other part that I think people don't really tend to do is to really look around at what else is there. Like, I'm a believer in particularly in policy change, that there are, really advocacy networks. I think people tend to think about their organization on its own, but I think you really need to think about your network as a whole. So if you're working on education policy, there are probably a dozen different groups in Houston who, touch education in some way. And you don't all need to do everything. You need to figure out who among can do which pieces of the overall campaign. So a lot of times recommend folks going through this sort of planning process, do it with their partners. So you could have a separate plan for your organization, and then another one for sort of a coalition or set of groups. So it's important to do, sort of an internal and external stand. What do you have? Who's on staff? What do they know how to do? What resources do you have available? Similar for external, outside of your organization. This is often referred to as like a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opposition, and threats. But really, first, you're just going to focus on the positive part of it. What are your assets? What are your challenges? And then sort of where are you? Doing a media audit, I think, is often overlooked. I mean, really, it's important to sort of take a step back, pull together all of the coverage on your issue, whether you're in it or not, whether it's positive or negative for you, and really put it all in one place and review it, to think about what has been successful, what hasn't, who's covering your issue, how much coverage is there, who are the other players who are getting into the press, and everything else. And then before you really get into any sort of messaging, is defining who you need to reach. So, who are the people? And often I think nonprofits sort of fall back on the sort of lazy answer, which is, oh, we need to reach opinion leaders, or we need to reach the general public. And the general public is not an audience. You need to think about, if you're targeting a city policy, who are the city council members who you need to reach and who influences them. So if a city council person is really influenced by developers, real estate developers, then you got to go find those real estate developers, and those are your target is them. Or if it's people in a certain club or whatever it is, you want to get as granular as you can on the audience. And then it's, define who they are and where they are in terms of readiness to receive your message. And then, you really, what are the core concerns? What's going to compel people to move towards your point of view? What do they know already? And where do you need to get them? Where are their existing concerns? So you got to meet them where they are. And I think you need to think through in each audience sort of what people think already, as opposed to, they don't know as much as you do about this issue. So where are they, and what do they need? What do they know? What do they think? And what are you going to be able to change? And then this gets to sort of what do they think? What's their value? And then what are the barriers to them changing? And then you really get into sort of the broader theme, right? So once you've got a nitty gritty of sort of all the different audiences and what are the themes that work to convey your big picture message. And once you've gone there, you dive into the sort of the individual messages. And so, you think about one statement, one message that needs to tap a value, echo the vision, overcome the barrier you identified, and have an ask. And that's why we sort of all these boxes in one, is you want to fill out all of this. And then this is where I think most nonprofits start, is on the tactics, right? They want to, you want to dive into, well, what are we going to do? We're going to talk, we should do a press conference to talk about A, B, or C, or we should have a editorial board meeting. And I think if you're not taking the time to think through all of your messaging, your audiences, and all that stuff, you're going to be really haphazard in the types of tactics that you choose and the timing of them. So it's important to sort of really take the time at the front end before you get into tactics. It's the last thing to think about, not the first. And so this gives you sort of just an easy chart to sort of look at tactics, timeline, assignment, and budget, and make sure when you come up with it, then you have some accountability about who's going to do what. All right, and then at the very end, once you figure out what you're going to do, you need to think about how you're going to decide if it worked. So what were the outputs that you said you're going to create in your plan, and what are the outcomes you're hoping to have from those outputs? And do you think it's going to, how are you going to measure whether or not you reach those goals? And that's really it. That's, a very quick view of a couple different pieces of sort of a great policy communications work. I'm sorry I talked fast and covered a lot of different stuff, but happy to talk about anything else or any specific situations you guys are facing, anything you want to talk through, or any questions about all the stuff we covered. Let's go back to our intro slide. Well, I hope that was helpful. Anybody?
All right. Well, if anybody doesn't have any more questions, I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Michael, for presenting. If you have any questions, please email me and I will be sending this out to you all. All right.
Great.
All right. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.